The next thing that I'd like to work on is to have the enemies drop something when they die. These are going to be power-ups that the player can then pick up and use themselves. To create these drops, I need to set up a new scene. Inside the scene, my first node is going to be an area 2D. I'll use this because it will allow me to detect collision with the player without actually having any physics attached to it. So I rename this node to item, and then I need to make sure that I update the collision properties accordingly. The layer for the item is going to be layer 5, which we've defined previously, and the collision mask is going to be on layer 2, which is against the player. So that's the only collision that we'll detect here, is whenever the player interacts with one of these items. Next, these items need a couple of child nodes. The first one is going to be a sprite 2D node, so we can actually see what we're looking at, and the second one is going to be a collision shape 2D. For the sprite 2D, we can go into our assets and the items folder, and you can see here I've got 3 different boxes: a coffee box, a gun box, and a health box. I'm going to drag over the health box, but it doesn't actually matter which one, because it will be the code that determines which texture we use for these items. Now that I've got my image, let's just go into my collision shape and set up a new rectangular shape. Just drag it out to the borders, and that should be pretty much it. Get the collision set up for this as well. Now we can save this one, and let's see if we can get the enemy code to drop one of these items. Back inside of our goblin scene, we go into our script, and we look for our die function, because the enemies are going to drop these items whenever they die. Underneath this die function, I'm going to create a new function called drop_item, and for now we'll just put pass inside of it. But this function can now be called inside of our die function, so we'll just call drop_item right at the end here. But the way dropping an item will work is that the goblin will basically just create an instance of this item node and then add it into our main scene. So to do that, it first needs to have it defined as a variable right at the top. So just underneath this onReady section that we've already got, I will create a new variable, which will be my item_scene, and I will set this up to be preloaded. And in here, I need to pass in the path of my item scene. So we'll just filter it out a little bit. We'll look into our scenes folder, and let's see if we can find the item scene down the bottom. There it is there. So now the scene that's in here, item.tscn, is going to be loaded into the goblin scene right at the start and saved inside the item scene variable, which means that we can create instances of it inside of our script. And that's what this new function is going to do. So if we go into drop item, we can remove the pass and instead create an item, which will be var item, and it will be set to our item scene dot instantiate. So we will instantiate that scene and create a new one from it called item. Once that's created, we need to position it. So we'll set the item's position to be the same as the enemy position. We also need to add it as a child of our main scene. But to do that, we need to actually know how to connect to the main scene, because this here is our goblin scene. The goblins are generated in the code, so they aren't automatically linked into our main scene up here. They aren't children by default. They come in when the enemy spawner creates them. So to do that, we have to go back up to the top, and here where we're currently creating a variable for our player scene, we can do the exact same thing for our main scene. I'll do it before actually, so that it's in correct order. So this new one is going to be variable called main, and I can just basically just remove this last section here. So we're looking into our root of our entire scene, and then we're looking into our main node here. Now, if we want to access the main node, just the same way as we accessed the player node before, we can just call this main variable. So we'll go back into our drop item function and continue with that. What we want to do is add this as a child into our main scene. So we could just run add child, but this may cause errors later on. So instead, I'm going to use call deferred. So I'll say main call deferred, and in here I'll pass the function that I want to run, which is add_child, and then the variable that I want to pass into it, which is the new item that we've just created. this line of code will only run once all of the physics processes are complete, and we won't interrupt anything and end up with any errors. And the last thing to do is take this item and add it to a group. We'll say add to group, and the group name is going to be items. We haven't actually created this group, but Godot will create it automatically for us. Take this item and stick it into that group. And we should actually have enough here to test this out. So if I kill one of the enemies, it drops that heart. Right now, that's all they're all going to do. So each one of them is going to drop the exact same item. Nothing happens when I pick it up, but we can see that that part is at least working. And now we can start adding a little bit of variety into these items. This will require us to create a new script. So we go into the item scene and the item node and add a script onto it. The first thing that I want to do is define a variable which is going to control the item type. So item type variable is going to be an integer. And I will add a comment here that we can then refer back to explain what these item types will be. So if we set this variable to a 0, then that is going to be a coffee. If we set it to a 1, then it's going to be the health. And if we set it to a 2, then it's going to be the gun. Now I need to load in the different images for these item boxes. Remember, they're inside this items, well, assets and then items. We've got coffee box, gun box, and health box. I can preload these and save them as variables. We can say coffee box and then preload. And then here we just look for our variable for the coffee box. I can just drag it over. I don't need to actually select the one specifically. So that is our coffeebox.png image. Then we just copy this down and repeat it for the other two items. So the second one is going to be a health box. So we just change the image name to health box. And the last one is gun box. So we just change the image name here to gun as well. So now you can see why it didn't actually matter which sprite we used inside of this node, because we're just going to change it depending on these variables. With that done, we can store them all inside of one array, which is going to be textures. So in here, we just pass in the coffee box, that's too many Fs, coffee box, health box, and lastly, the gun box. So that takes these three textures and stores them inside of one array. Inside of our ready function then, we can assign our texture. So we can drag over this sprite2d node, access the texture property, and then go into our textures array. From here, we will pick the item that corresponds to the item type variable. So we can just copy this variable and put it in here as our index. But the variable isn't defined. So we've created item type and we say it's an integer, but we haven't assigned a value to it. And that's going to be done by the Goblin script. So as soon as we create one of these items and we assign a position to it, just underneath that, we will say item.item_type, and we can access this variable now because it's been created inside of the item script. This is going to be a random integer, inside of a range between 0 and 2. So it'll be 0, 1, or 2. Now let's save all of this and just try it out. What should now happen, if we did everything correctly, is that we now get different items depending on, well, just chance. It can be any one of them just based on a random number generator. So right now I'm getting a whole bunch of coffees and not a lot of hearts until the first one dropped right there. Now that we've got the items dropped and we've got them randomized, we need to actually check what happens when the player picks them up. We don't need this process function, so we're back inside of our item node here, our item scene. We don't need this process function, we can delete that. Instead, we can go into our main node, this parent area 2D, and go into its signals. The signal we want is body entered. If we connect that into our main script, or rather the main script of this scene, we get this onBodyEntered function created. So whenever the player enters one of these item collision boxes, we're going to get this function firing. And here, based on our item type variable, we can then decide what happens depending on which box is being picked up. So let's just do them in order. We've got coffee first, and we can say if item type is equal to 0, well, that means that the coffee is just being picked up. So let's say print coffee. And then after that, we'll say the second one is health. It's actually lives, but I've called it health. So we'll say elif item type is equal to 1, then we should get an extra bit of health, or we should get one more life. So we'll say lives, and then we'll add the last one, which is the gun. So this will be another elif item type is equal to 2, and we'll just print gun. And after all of that is done, we need to actually delete this item box. So we'll say delete item, and that's done by running q3. Now let's test this out. We kill a couple of enemies, so we'll kill this one, and we pick up a gun. And down here it says gun. Kill this one, and it's a life. So now we picked up lives. So we're now detecting them, we're getting the difference between the three. So let's actually add in the code to, well, react to what's happened. When the player picks up the coffee box, what I want to happen is for them to boost his speed. So basically the player is going to run much faster than normal. We don't have any functionality for that in the player script yet, so we need to add some of that in. Right now I'm defining the speed as 200, but instead I will create two constants at the top here. So the difference is they're not going to be starting with var for variable, they will be constants. And this one is going to be called start speed. It will be an integer, and we define it right here because it's a constant, means it doesn't change, as 200. So that is our start speed. But I'll create a second one, which will be the boost speed. And this is also an integer, but it's double that. So it's actually going to be 400. Then when I define my speed in the ready function, instead of setting it to a fixed value of 200, I will assign it to my start speed variable. This will give me a way of differentiating between a normal speed and a boosted speed. But I don't want this boost to last forever. So I need a timer, basically a cooldown. So once I've picked up the boost or this coffee box, my speed is increased, but only for a certain amount of time. Well, to track time, I need a timer. So we'll create another timer node and change the name of this one to boost timer. And if I go into the inspector, I can set some of the properties. Well, it needs to be a one shot. This timer just happens the one time when I pick up this item box. And the wait time is effectively how long this effect lasts. So I'm going to set it to 6 seconds. Now that this is done, I can create a new function. So we'll go right to the bottom here and just underneath the physics process. So I'll keep the other function underneath it. And I'll create a function called boost. And inside of this function, two things are going to happen. The first is that this timer, boost timer, is going to start. So we've picked up this item and we've now boosted our speed, so we start the timer right away. The other thing is that we set our speed to boost speed. So now the player is going to run way faster, but we need to check for the timeout from this boost timer. So we go into nodes and its timeout signal, and we link it into this script. Now, when the boost timer runs out, we just set our speed back to our start speed. But none of this will work unless we actually call this boost function. So we go back into our item. When we pick up the coffee, instead of just printing out that we picked it up, we need to call that boost function. We already know the body, because whenever there's a collision here, it returns the body that has collided. We can just pass body.boost. If I run this code now, we'll need to run around and kill a few enemies until I can pick up this coffee. Oh, there we go, straight away. So I'll pick that up, and instantly the player runs twice as fast. And after about 6 seconds, if I don't get killed, I should slow down. There we go, I'm back to normal speed again. So that takes care of our first item, coffee. The second one is health, or lives, and this one is actually a little bit easier. All we need to do is go into our main scene and change this lives variable. We just need to add +1 to it. But how do we link our item into our main scene? Well, the same way as we have with some of our other scripts. So where was it? Maybe the goblin script right at the top. Yeah, we have this onReady variable right at the beginning. I can pretty much just copy that and put it into the item script as well, right at the top. So now, as soon as we drop an item, it will create a main variable, which is going to be that node, our main node. And now we can access all of the variables inside of it. But for us, it isn't enough just to change that variable, because that variable is also displayed, remember, in our heads up display. So it's displayed over here. I need to increase the variable, but also update this text at the same time. So that means that I actually need another onReady variable, which is going to be my lives label. So I need to access that label from this node as well. And that means going into root / main, then it's our heads up display and / lives label. Now that I have both of these variables, whenever I pick up one of those health boxes, I can first of all say main.lives is increased by 1. And then I go into that lives label variable, go into its text property, and just like I did before, I will update this to say x plus the string of main.lives. So let's test this one out, and let's see if we can get a heart early on. So we got coffee, coffee. Okay, so I've got 3 lives at the moment, pick that one up, and now I've got 4. And the last one is the gun, and what I want to happen here is just to increase the shooting speed of the player. And that is controlled by the shot timer. So we actually have a timer already, and it's set to 1 second. Well, this was just kind of arbitrary anyway. So what I will do is the same thing as I've done with my start speed and boost speed. I will create a couple of constants to control my shooting speed. So I'll say my normal shot is a float. So it's not an integer this time because it's a decimal. And that's 0.5 seconds. I know I've got 1 second in here, but I'm going to override it with the code instead. Then I create another constant, which is my fast shot. And this is another float, which will be 0.1 seconds. So it's going to fire 5 times as fast as it will in a normal condition. When the game begins, just like I've assigned my speed to start speed, I need to also take my shot timer and assign its wait time property to be equal to normal shot. And I'll just reorganize some of this because I'd like to have these variables that I'm assigning at the top first, and then it's my position, speed, and shot timer. So now, just the same way as I created a boost function, I can create another function called quick fire. And this function will work in the same way as the boost function. In fact, I need a timer for this as well. I need an extra cooldown timer to let me know when this effect has worn off. So we'll add another timer node here and change that to fast fire timer. This will also be a one-shot timer, and the effect is going to last 4 seconds. As soon as this quick fire function begins, we want to take that fast fire timer and we want to start it. Same as we did with our boost. But now instead of changing the speed, we change our shot timer. So we bring that down here and we set the wait time to fast shot. Lastly, we need to check for this fast fire timer expiring. So when we get this timeout signal and we have this new function at the bottom, we want to take our shot timer, set the wait time back to normal shot. And then the last thing to do, I think, is just to call this quick fire function. So inside of our item script, whenever we pick up the item type 2, we go into our body, which is the player, and call the quick fire function. And I'll just quickly fix this little typo down here. So now if we test this out again, and this time I'm looking for a gun. So I'll pick up the live, take me to 4, another live, see if I can get a gun. No guns yet, all just lives and coffees. Okay, this is the danger of... Oh, okay, well I'll go one right at the end. So now if I hold down the mouse click, you can see that I'm actually shooting way faster than before. And then the effect runs out, and now I'm just shooting at normal half-a-second shots. And I just noticed another little typo here. I'll change font to gun. And I think that's it for the item. So I can close this scene down. We don't need to do anything else to it for now. And we can close the script as well. Now the only thing I want to change there is back inside of our goblin script, which is the fact that they actually drop an item every time they die. And we don't want that. That was just done so that we can quickly test this. I want them to only sometimes drop an item. So I will create a new constant, which is going to be drop chance. And this will be a float, which I will set to 0.1, which basically means 10% of the time they're going to drop an item. We can now use this variable inside of our die function here. So rather than just calling drop item every time, we actually put in an if statement. We'll generate a random float, and if that float is less than or equal to drop chance, well, then we will drop an item. But if it isn't, then we're just going to skip that function altogether. So if we test this out, I'm not going to get an item every time I kill one of the enemies. In fact, most of the times they're not going to drop anything. So by changing that number, you change how difficult the game is, because these boosts give the player a good advantage. This video has already gotten quite long, but there's one little thing that I still want to add, which is that when the enemies die, nothing really happens. It's a bit anticlimactic. They just kind of disappear into half of their body. I'd like to just add a small explosion effect. So let's create a new scene, and inside this we need a particle node. There's CPU and GPU particles, so I'm going to use CPU particles for this, and I'll rename the node to explosion. We save the scene and then we can start customizing it. So if we go into the 2D view, we'll be able to see what's happening to it as we configure it. So right now it's just emitting, well, these little particles, and they're shooting down away. To go into the detail of all of these settings will take an entire video, so I'm not going to do that, but I just want to get it set up. The first thing I want to do is stop applying gravity to them so that they're not just falling down. So we go into the gravity tab here and change the Y setting to 0. Well, that kind of kills them instantly. So we'll go into our initial velocity and apply a value here instead. So we'll set a minimum of 90 and a maximum of 110. Now they're shooting off in all directions, so let's change the spread to 180. And now it's kind of spreading it a little bit more randomly, but in a circle. We'll also change our emission shape, which is up here, and make it a sphere, which will be 5 pixels wide. And right now it's not really looking like an explosion, they're just emitting at random times. To fix that, we go into time and set this explosiveness variable all the way up to 1. This will mean that they all fire out at the same time, so it looks like an actual explosion now. I also want more of them, so we'll say we'll have 20. We'll change the lifetime to 0.5, so it's a quicker and shorter explosion. And then I will play around with their scale down here. So in the scale, I will change the minimum to 14, maximum to 16, which gives us much bigger particles. But I also want them to fade out over time as well, and you can change that by adding a new curve. So we customize the curve to first of all put them all the way to the top at the very beginning. So this is time along the bottom and size along the left. And then at the end, we want to bring them down to nothing. So they just kind of disappear at the end of their life. So that gives me particles. I just want to change the color as well. So I'm going to go with a reddish, no, we'll get rid of most of the green, most of the blue, and not too red, something like that, kind of pastelish. So I think that's mostly it. Now I don't want them to constantly be emitting like they are here, so we want to get rid of this emitting and make them one-shot particles. So as soon as they're created, they just shoot out, and then that's it. And to control how they're shot out, we will need a little script here. So we add a script onto it. And really all it needs to do is, as soon as this node is created, so this ready function is fired, we set the emitting variable to true. So the first time this is created, it starts to emit. And then inside of the process function, we just check if it's stopped emitting. So if not emitting, then we can delete this particle. We'll just say Q free. And that should be everything for this explosion. So we'll close it down. And we need to go into our goblin and actually create this whenever the goblin dies. It's going to work similarly to the item scene. The item scene gets created and dropped when the goblin dies. So we do the same thing for these particles. We'll copy this code and just change item scene to explosion scene. And we'll change item here to load in the explosion scene there as well. Now we go into our die function down here. And after we've dropped an item, we'll create an explosion. So we'll say explosion is equal to explosion scene dot instantiate. And when that's finished, we need to position it. So explosion dot position is equal to the goblin's own position. And then we need to add this as a child to the main node. So pretty much what we've done just down below here. But we don't need to call deferred because our explosion doesn't have any collision in it. So we'll just say main.addChild, and inside here we'll pass in the explosion variable, which is the node we just created. And then lastly, one small thing that's easy to overlook is that when we eventually get to pause the game later on, like when the player dies, for example, and we get a game over screen, We want everything to stop, but we don't want the explosion to stop. We want that to actually continue and finish. So to do that, we need to say explosion.processMode, which is what controls whether something runs when it's paused or not. And in fact, I should be able to find it down here. We have underneath node this process property and a mode. So we have different modes available to us. Inherit is the default, then we've got pausable, runs only when paused, runs always, and is disabled. We want the explosion to run all the time. Even when the game is paused, we want the explosion to continue running because it's got a finite life anyway. So we just set that process mode to node, which is the name of this node here, dot process mode always. So always is the one from this drop-down box that just makes sure that even when a game is paused, it's going to keep running. Now let's just see when I run it if this works fine. So when I kill one of the goblins, we now get that little particle explosion coming out. And that's us actually finished with the goblin scene as well. So we can save this and close that one down too. I know that was a long video, but I covered quite a lot there. So if you found that useful, then please leave a like and I'll see you in the next one.